Hello, my name is Bruce Miller, and I'm with RimTech Consulting. This session is about why most EDRMS projects fail. And I truly believe that most do. A shockingly high percentage of modern EDRMS projects fail. This is EDRMS, which is Electronic Document and Records Management Systems. So let's start with what compliance means, because without that, we can't tell success or failure. So I have three criteria that to me constitutes a compliant EDRMS or a successful EDRMS. Number one is that every document in SharePoint adheres to the retention schedule. That means every document has an official rule from that schedule assigned to it. Number two, all documents are being managed as a record. And that means that the documents are immutable, they're assigned a retention rule, and we are tracking and measuring event-based trigger dates, which means, well, in typical EDRMS world out there, 60% or more of all records are event-based. We call them case records. And in order to properly run disposition against those records, you need to have event dates for every single case or every single adventure of related records triggered by an event date. So without that, you're not able to do a disposition on 60% of your records, which is a pretty big failure. And number three, the biggest main criteria for a successful EDRMS is, can we do a disposition of millions of documents in a single key press? In order to do that, you have to have confidence. Confidence that your classification accuracy rate is over 85%. So we'll talk about how to make sure that happens later. So there are two lethal threats to any modern EDRMS project. Two. Here they are. Number one is failure to reach 85% classification accuracy. I'm going to try to make the case later in this session that there's no way to fix it if it goes down below that number. I'll also try to make the case that it has to be measured daily in order to prove it. So one way or the other, we have to prove mathematically and unambiguously that the system is accurate above 85% classification accuracy rate in order to proceed with the disposition. The second is we don't manage case records properly. Again, if we don't track and use thousands of event dates, then there's no way we can do disposition properly for over 60% of our records. And this is a huge shortcoming of many EDRMS projects. So those are the two failures. Now, there's a third one if you happen to be using Purview, and that is failure to deploy Purview properly. There are 5 products out there to manage records in SharePoint, 5 of them. One is made by Microsoft, it's called Purview. And that one, it's tricky to deploy properly, easy to deploy improperly. So if you are a Purview user, then you have that concern, and that's a risk for your project. You don't have that risk with the other 4 products. So obviously we have to avoid each of these 4 problems. So we'll go through each one independently, starting with the SharePoint IA. But before we get to that, think about this for a minute. Where does compliance come from? Well, it turns out there are 2 schools of thought. One says compliance comes from end users. It's their responsibility to manage records. They have an obligation to do so that I've seen enshrined in corporate policy in many government organizations and even some private. So that's the old school way of thinking, which is, yeah, users are responsible for identifying the records and classifying them against the retention schedule. Here's school of thought number 2, which is, wait a minute, no way that's going to work. Compliance comes from the organization and it is imposed on end users, okay? So if user Fred wants this document to be kept for 10 years, and user Joe says, no, it should be 3 years, and user Mary says 16 years, well, who's right? The answer is none of them are right. The official retention schedule should be imposed on these documents, regardless of what the users think, okay? So which one is right? I'm here to say the scheme whereby we impose record keeping is the right way. Why? Because the other way doesn't work. I've never seen it work in my career, and I don't expect to see it work in my lifetime. Users aren't going to get classification right, and they're not going to get it consistent. Without that, when you have millions of records coming at you, you cannot ensure a reliable, safe environment for disposition down the road. It's not possible. So I'm a believer that the only way to get record keeping in an EDRMS successful is automation, because without the users involved, that's the only option we have, right? So did you know that a typical user in a modern EDRMS creates or not necessarily creates, but causes 12 records a day to be born. They either create them or download them or receive them via email or send via email, but 12 a day. If you have 1,000 users, for instance, that's 12,000 records a day flowing every day at the system that have to be managed as records somehow. And that's a flow rate that no records manager can possibly touch, intervene with, control, correct, or in short, do anything with. It's too many. So we also know that we can't really rely on end users. Did I say really? We cannot rely on end users, period, to decide what are records, what's transitory, and how to classify them. It just doesn't work. So therefore, we have to automate. And that's what this is all about, which is how do we automate so that it will work and we can actually proceed with a disposition. So you know what I know instinctively, I'm sure you do, which is if we take one document, present it to 10 users, the same document, and ask them two questions. A, is this a record? And B, where does it belong in the retention schedule? You're going to get 7, 8, 9, maybe even 10 different answers. And which of those will be right? Probably none. Maybe sometimes it'll be right. Usually, no. That's not what we can base an EDRMS on. That's not safe. So we're going to have to automate. So this session is about these 5 products. Whichever product you have, it does not matter. This session could care less about which product you have. It's the same points for all 5. Okay, so let's look at the case records first, shall we? That's the big one. That's 60% of all your records are case records. And this has a profound effect on how SharePoint is structured. In other words, the information architecture, or what we call the IA. It's also probably the single biggest mistake I've ever seen in EDRMS projects. So what are case records? They are members of case categories or business activities in the retention schedule. And these are business activities generally about a person, a place, an event, or a thing. And what they all have in common is that those activities consist of a series of repeated adventures. And each adventure generates a series of related records independent of the other adventures. And each adventure ends with an event date. Okay? And a good example are audits. You might do a health and safety audit in February, and that generates a set of records for that audit. You might do a second audit in November where you're auditing financial statements, and it's a completely different adventure. Each adventure, or what we call a case, generates different records, a different volume of records, and the health and safety case from February is not related to the financial statement adventure or case in November, let's say. So, so each adventure has to be kept separate somehow from all the other adventures, right? And each one has a different event date, although there will only be one single retention rule for that entire record series or category. For example, audits might have a rule that says keep for 5 years after end of audit and then destroy. So the trigger date, however, for each adventure or each audit is the end date. So it'll be contract end date if we have contracts, because they're case records, employment end date for employee records, or project end date for projects. And the disposition software, that disposition process in the software uh, destroys all the records in one case as a package deal, but it does so by calculating the retention period based on the end date. Okay, so if you have 1,000 contracts, 1,000 employees, and 1,000 projects, you have 3,000 event dates. So you have to record, track, maintain those 3,000 event dates, or the software can't do its business. It can't calculate the disposition date. Now, what about the opposite? Well, 40% of the time, the records don't have any events going on. It's just ongoing business activity. And the retention rule is triggered on the document's age. So how does the software calculate the age? Well, it takes today's date, subtracts the document's date, which obviously yields the age of the document. And then it compares the age of the document to the retention period. If the age is younger than the retention period, it's retained. If it's older, then it's marked for disposition. So each individual document gets tagged for retention for disposition, not the package of records in a given case. So here's another cold, hard reality about case records. And this illustrates one of many ways in which the um, proper handling of case records dramatically impacts the way you structure SharePoint. If we have 1,000 contracts, and you probably do, then every time someone puts a document into SharePoint about a contract, we have no choice but to force the user to tell us which of those 1,000 contracts this document is related to. Same thing with employees. If I'm putting in a document related to an employee, I have no choice but to force the user to tell me which employee are you talking about so we can assign it to the right case. So this is mathematical. This has little to do with records at first glance because just think of it common sense. Excuse me, we can't put a document into SharePoint and say, this document is about a contract, but I'm not going to tell you which contract it's about. Makes no sense, right? So the mechanism by which we do this, whether it's a drop down, a flyout, a pop up, or whatever the mechanism is, doesn't matter. Mathematically, this is an unavoidable reality. You have to force the user to tell us which project, which contract, which employee, or which audit, whatever the case records may be about. Now, here's a practical way it's done, or at least the way that we do it, is when you're in a library, that library equates to a activity or category in the business, in the retention schedule, a business activity. So here we have competitive procurement right here. This is the name of the library, competitive procurement. And let's pretend we have, I don't know, 100 or so such procurements on the go at any one time. Those procurements are adventures. In other words, they're case records. So we have to group together all the related records within each case. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cases. They're each a document set in that library. And you'll notice this little container. This is what the container looks like. It's not a folder. It is a document set, which is a group of related documents. Now, in the latest version of SharePoint, they've changed that symbol. It doesn't look like this anymore. So if you have a newer version of Purview, it'll look a little different, but the principle is the same. These are not folders. These are not documents. These are cases, document sets. So here's a hypothetical example of a retention schedule with 253 categories in it. 250 are admin categories, not cases. 3 are case categories, contracts, employees, and projects. Of those 3, each is divided into 1,000 cases. So we have 1,000 contracts, 1,000 employees, and 1,000 projects. Where are these records going to go? Well, they have to go somewhere in SharePoint, right? And each case has to have a different place. That way we don't mix up records from one case with another. So that means that for each of these 3 categories, we have one retention rule. For contracts, for example, it might be keep for 7 years after end of contract, then destroy. But we have 1,000 different contracts that this record could be related to. Similarly for employees and projects. So that means for each of the case records we have, there are 3,000 potential places for it to land in SharePoint. Put in reverse, that means we have to build 1,000 places in SharePoint. Now, what about all the records that are headed towards administrative categories? Well, they're not broken down into cases. So there are 250 places in SharePoint. Place, location, library, whatever you want to call it, you've got to put it somewhere in SharePoint. So in this simple illustration, there are a total of 3,250 places for documents to go in SharePoint. 250 places for the admin records and 3,000 places for the case records. So that takes it nicely into the SharePoint information architecture, which has to support this. So think of the architecture as a three-layer cake. The retention schedule, SharePoint, the structure, which is libraries, sites, document sets, and columns or metadata. And then at the top of the pyramid are what I call RBR, rules-based record keeping. Those are the automation rules that you construct to assign classification automatically to each document that flows into SharePoint. So we use the one-to-one-to-one approach, which is one category in the retention schedule equals one SharePoint in library of the same name. And in that library is a a content type of the same name. Okay? What is a content type? It's a container of metadata unique to that library. So all three have the same name. So here are two examples. If I have a library called, or a category in the retention schedule called safety, I'll have a library called safety, and it will contain a content type or bag of columns called safety. If I have a case category called contracts, the library will still be called contracts, the content type will be called contracts, but this library will be broken into 1,000 document sets, one for each contract. Okay? So graphically, let's pretend for a moment we had 800 categories, which is kind of normal for 1,000 users. 1,000 categories in the retention schedule. 60% are case records. That means that I have 480 um, uh, categories on the right here, case categories that are broken into cases. And you can see that the retention tag is tied to each case, not to each document. What about the 320 remaining categories? Well, the retention tag, the hypothetical retention tag, is tied to each document. So each document falls on a conveyor belt, X years wide, where X is the retention period, and they fall off one by one. That doesn't happen over here for these 480 activities. The records are grouped together by case, and the entire case is on a conveyor belt, X years wide, and then the whole case falls off the conveyor belt at the end of the retention period. Okay. Now let's go up to SharePoint. One level up in the pyramid. Now we have 800 libraries. 480 are case libraries. 320 are not. So the 480 shown on the right are broken into document sets. But now each library has metadata. And I'll give you two statistical tidbits here. One is that a healthy modern EDRMS has on average 14 metadata fields per library. And that doesn't mean the users enter 14. They actually enter 2.1 of those 14 on average. Again, where does that number come from? It comes from our clients. That's what we do every day. And right across the market, no matter what kind of business you're in, this is the average of all of our clients. So it's a very realistic number. So now we have 320 admin libraries that are not divided into cases and 480 that are. And think of it this way. Each of the 800 libraries has a unique package of metadata columns. That's what SharePoint calls a metadata field, a column. And each library's columns is different from those of the other 799. And when you really think about it, that's an absolute mathematical necessity, because if one library had exactly the same metadata as another, something wrong. It means the two activities are the same. right? So they must by definition be different. Now, this is where the fun starts. This is the part that makes it all work. The content automation rules. Each of these 5 products, no matter which one you buy, you've got to create automation rules that make this system work. I call this the beating heart of an EDRMS. Did you know that each one of these 5 products has 2 categories of rules, not one? Most modern records managers, or I shouldn't say modern, most of today's records managers are kind of sucker punched into this. They think rules, rules. Well, I have retention rules. That must be what we're talking about. And you're not wrong. You might have a retention schedule of, let's say, 250 categories, which I see every day, sadly. And in among those 250 categories, you might have 50 to 100 unique retention rules. What's a unique retention rule? It's a permutation of parameters, meaning 5 years, keep 5 years, then destroy. That is a permutation. 5 years and then transfer, that's another permutation. 10 years, then destroy, that's another permutation. If you take out all the duplicates, you probably are left with only 50 to 100 uniquely different retention rules. And honestly, you could put those into any one of these 5 products in an afternoon if you have patience. You just pound them into the software, right? 50 of them, at most 100. But that's not what makes the system run. What makes the system run are are content rules. What's a content rule? A content rule is a rule that you create that says for this SharePoint content, apply this retention rule from my list of 50 to 100 retention rules. Okay? Now, content rules are called something different in each of the 5 products. In the case of Microsoft Purview, they're called auto-apply policy. With Gimmal, they're called life cycles. With Collabware, they're called content rules. I think with RecordPoint, they're called patterns and outcomes. It doesn't matter what they're called. You have to create them. Now, here's an important statistic to note. In a modern, healthy, successful EDRMS, the average number of content rules per category, which is another way to say per library, is 3. So in our example, if we have 800 categories in our retention schedule, we have 800 libraries. We will have 2,400 content rules, and that is normal, healthy, and good, okay? So you have to create these rules. So here's an example. I have a library called audits, and we want to keep the final report much longer than all the rest of the documents that were used to generate the final report. So we want, let's say, a 25-year retention for the final report and 5 years on everything else. So how do we do that? Very simple. We create 2 content rules. The first rule says, if we have a library called audits, and in that library, there's a metadata field, a column, in the case of Microsoft anyway, called final report, and the value of that is yes, then apply this rule here. Audits, final report. And we go down, rule number 7, audits final report is audit end date plus 10 years and destroy. I said 25, I should have said 10. Fair enough? Now, what about all the rest of the documents? Well, they're going to have final report equals no. So then we're going to apply a retention rule that says 5 destroy, which is keep 5 years and destroy. No events, right? This is a regular, ordinary retention rule. So you can mix and match all of these situations that you want, and that's how you end up with 3 per library on average, okay? So 2,400 of these rules. This is what makes the system work. It cannot do anything with just the retention rules. It's the left-hand side, the content rules, that make your project run. And I thought I'd show you some examples. Here's an example from Collabware, and they use the actual phrase content rules. And here's the condition that has to be met. This one says SharePoint column department operator is equal to, and the value is administration. So they're looking for content where the department equals administration. Simple as that. Then they'll apply a retention rule to it. This is from Gimmal. They're creating a classification rule here. The property is the column in SharePoint right here. The operator equal to, greater than, less than, what have you. And then the value that the column has to contain. And with this product, you can actually do Boolean joins. You can have and or not between separate rules. Now, this is from Opus. Their Opus is made by AvePoint. And here is the screen that you fill in when you create a content rule. So look at the top here. It says apply term by. What's a term? A term is what they call a retention rule, the right-hand side of that diagram that I showed you earlier. So they're going to apply a term by criteria. Define the criteria. Well, the criteria is between the if right here and the then down there. And once again, you can see the same kind of thing going on. I have a column called name that must contain the word test, or a column approved that equals yes, or a column approved by that contains a value that matches with the name Smith. Now, these are all just examples here. This isn't the real one, but you can see you can get quite sophisticated mixing and matching these conditions that had to be met. And after the condition is met, or I should say, if and when the condition is met, then you apply the following term and you pick a retention rule down below here. Okay. What about Microsoft Purview? Well, same thing. You have to create a content rule, which they call an auto apply policy. Okay. And then you apply that label. And what's a label in Purview? A label is the retention rule. Again, it's the piece on the right-hand side, right? So you apply this label to content that matches specific properties. So here we're going to apply this rule or label called safety audits. 10 years, review, and delete. What's the condition? It's down here. Refinable string 45 equals audits and refinable string 00 equals reports. Now that language is called KQL. It's a keyword query language. So you have to learn how to type in these conditions, but it's actually pretty straightforward. It's this one is the library name, operator is equal, and the value is audits. A column here would be, if I recall, the column is final. Is the audit the final audit or not? So refinable string 00 represents final equals reports or yes or no, whatever you build into your rule. Okay. So these things are real, and this is what makes your system work. So up top here, you're going to create these 2,400 or so rules. After they're done, think about this. They have the effect of locking together all three layers of this. Why? Because the rules, which operate 24/7, 24 hours a day, ceaselessly, they're checking these 12,000 records a day, every day, all day, to see which ones meet the conditions in the rules. And the rules contain the name of the libraries, and they contain the name of the metadata fields. So imagine what would happen if you change the name of the library or a column. The rule would break, and you'd no longer be compliant. Okay? So in other words, the system must be static. Once you build it, don't touch it. Leave it alone and it'll work just fine. If you want to build a new library, fine, but start at the bottom and work your way up to the top. What has to stop in an EDRMS is what we call SharePoint in the wild, where you have people inventing libraries and columns every day of the week for any reason they want. That has to come to a stop. So now, how do we prove our compliance? We've got to be compliant. At 12,000 a day, that's 2.7 million records per year in a typical system, okay? If you were to think that the records manager could just take a casual check of those records, forget it. 12 a day, not going to happen. It would take you 25 full-time employees to check all 12,000 every day. Put another way, if it was just one records manager, you would need 25 days of work to check 1 day's worth of records. Just think about this for 2 days worth, 3 days worth. It just gets insane. So bottom line, at 1 minute per record, There is no way the records manager could possibly see, touch, evaluate, criticize, correct any mistakes. In other words, cannot touch these records. Hands off. So we know our target. We have to guarantee 85% accuracy per day, every day, no compromises. And if we cannot prove that it's above 85%, there's no way we can do a disposition because we're disposing of records and we don't know when they're being disposed of, right? We could be breaking laws, let alone policy. So here's an example of a very troubled project. They received 6,000 records per day, but a classification error rate of 50%. In 1 week, they accumulate 15,000 mistakes. You cannot fix that. It's just too many people that you'd need to hire to do it. No one's going to go out and hire 13 full-time employees. It's just not going to happen, right? So how are we going to do this? We need to measure it every single day. So the way we do it is with modern statistics. And that states that you don't need to check every one of these 12,000 documents. You only need to sample them. And if you sample them scientifically, correctly, mathematically, according to the statistical formula, then whatever number you come up with for the accuracy will be correct 19 times out of 20 with a 95% confidence level. In other words, that could be as low as 90% of the number you measured, or as high as 95% of the number you measured, or 90%. Sorry, could be as low as 80, or it could be as high as 95 if you measured 85%. All I'm trying to say here is that the number you come up with has a range of 5% on either side of accuracy, whatever the number may be, right? So, is this good enough to stand up in court? Yes, I firmly believe it is. What makes me say that? Well, just conversations with a lot of lawyers and a few judges. So, how many samples are we going to need out of the 12,000? Turns out the answer is 362. How long will that take? 362 minutes, which is 6 hours. Still too much for the records manager. So what we typically do here is we distribute the workload across the organization by department. So let's say we had 1,000 employees, 10 departments, 100 people per department, and one information management administrator, or IMA, per department. Who is the IMA? Someone who carries out 7 specific duties to keep the EDRMS healthy. This is one of the 7, taking daily measurements. So if we divide the 362 by 10, then each IMA has 36 minutes of work to do, and that's totally viable. So what we do is each of the IMAs takes 36 samples, which takes 36 minutes, and then they come up with their accuracy rate, and then 10 of them send that result to the records manager by 5 o'clock, and we have the daily accuracy rate, okay? Here's an example. If someone were to measure 18 right and 18 wrong, then that would be 50% accuracy rate, which we certainly don't want. So here's how to interpret the number that you get every day. That number is 95% confident. So let's say you measured 90% accuracy, which certainly you should at least. Then that means it could be as low as 85. It could be as high as 95. You don't know. But 19 times out of 20 is going to be right. Okay? So the real number we're shooting for is 90% accuracy. That way we will never slip below 85%. Because if you're going to do a disposition, let's say 2-3 years from now, you're going to blow away millions of documents in one keystroke. You better have confidence, right? And you should have a record of this measurement every single day. Now you can go into court, have a deposition, and prove that what you did was in full accordance with the retention schedule. You can prove that what you did was the right thing and defend it. After all, that's what we call disposition, right? Legally defensible disposition. Okay, so that's it. I've now told you the 2 lethal threats and the handful of things you need to do to avoid them. So all that's left on our plate now is one one risk, which is Purview deployment. With Purview, it's possible to deploy it incorrectly, and that will take your project down. So if you're a Purview user, let's take a look at this, okay? Number one, we have to reverse the posture. Out of the box, Purview says compliance comes from end users. And by posture, I mean that that's the behavior of the software. Every feature that it has puts the user out in front of the records manager. There's a button in SharePoint called Apply Label. We do not want that because that means that the user can pick any label they want and override the retention from the retention schedule. That's not compliance. That's upside down. So we have to reverse that by avoiding the button. We have to avoid retention policies because they conflict with retention labels, and we have to use auto apply. So I'm going to show you each of these quickly, okay? Now, out of the box, as I said, the posture of Purview is retention comes from users. Please, it does not. This is upside down. Microsoft got it wrong. So look at how Microsoft compares with their four competitors for the records management space. Of the four competitors, they rarely, if ever, do anything but automation. In fact, I think you'd have to work pretty hard to find a way to do manual or user-driven declaration from those four products. But with Purview, it's the opposite. Out of the box, if you do nothing, if you follow their instructions, you're going to do it completely via end users, which is wrong. Thankfully, they do have automation, and we're going to show you how to do that, okay? Now, first thing you want to avoid is publishing a label. This is why, and this is what publishing means. Publishing is how Purview makes labels available to products. What are products? Products are SharePoint, Exchange, OneDrive, and 7 other products that I don't care to know about. I'm only caring about Exchange, SharePoint, and OneDrive for today anyway. So the way it works is you take a label, which remember is a retention rule, put it in a shopping bag called a label policy. And then you bring the bag of labels to the product shown in blue here on the right. Okay. So here's label policy A, which has labels 1 and 3. And then B, which has 3, 4, and 5. Notice 3 is in both. That's fine. So here's my analogy. Think of each product in blue as a house. Good old-fashioned Georgian house with a wraparound porch. The house has rooms. The rooms are occupied by users. Okay. When you publish a label policy to a house, you're dropping off the bag of labels on the front porch, you're turning around and running across the street like heck as fast as you can. Because the minute you drop it on the porch, everybody can come out of those rooms and grab whatever labels they want and use them in whatever room and whatever documents they wish, whether you agree with it or not. That is not compliance. That's the opposite of compliance. So, what few people know about SharePoint and Purview is that when you first install SharePoint and get it up and running in your tenant for the first time, the button that allows users to apply labels doesn't exist. It's turned off. There is no button. To me, that's perfect, right? But the minute you publish your first policy, the button is turned on in both Exchange, SharePoint, and OneDrive, and you cannot turn it back off. To me, that completely and utterly destroys your system. You now have ruined it, and there's no turning back. Here's the button right here. Apply label. Let any user decide what retention rule they want for any reason they want, and let them change their mind as many times as they care to. Multiply that by 1,000 users, and is that compliance? Absolutely not. It's the reverse. You're putting yourself at the at the mercy of all the users. You will never come close to your 85%. Excuse me. So please never publish a policy. You have to reverse the compliance posture of Purview in order to get this right. So now, if we're not going to do it by the users, how are we going to do it? We're going to automate it and automate it via an auto apply policy. There are at least 6 mechanisms by which you can apply labels. And remember, a label is a retention rule in SharePoint. Of these, this is the only one that's safe for 4 reasons. It doesn't wake up the button. Users are not involved. Highly dependable because we can control the metadata that we use in these rules. And it doesn't depend on AI, words inside the document. When you read in Purview based on content, what that really is saying is it's saying, is the word or phrase found inside the document? AI can find that for you. Well, don't use that because it's not reliable or dependable. For example, did you know that 4/5 of all modern digital records are emails? Yeah, that's true. So imagine depending on the content in emails. When's the last time you saw an email where the subject line said, here it is, or as requested, or approved, right? So big picture, we never put yourself in a dependency on words inside anything. Just don't go there. Depend on metadata that you can control. That's the reason why auto apply is the only safe method. So the secret in Purview is to know what to avoid, when to work around things that aren't good, and when to use custom programming. So the big picture for Microsoft Purview is this, is compliance comes from users. That's upside down. Records management is done their way, not the way we're used to it, okay? And it's part of a much larger compliance picture. So when Microsoft says Purview, they mean way more than records. Here's my analogy. Purview is a big, heavy, hollow bowling ball. Inside it is a golf ball rattling around. Purview is the bowling ball. Purview Records Management is the golf ball. I'm here to talk about the golf ball only. I don't care about the bowling ball, the rest of the compliance. I think it's fine. I don't have any complaints or problems with it. Okay. Microsoft speaks a different language when it comes to records. They invented a new language that you are going to have to learn, and it's extremely technical. How technical? Trust me, you'll need IT's help. So it's not like Purview is a piece of software that you just learn and use. It doesn't work like that. It's more of a tool kit than an application software product. Users will never see Purview. It's not meant for users, but you as a records manager will have to use it to build your 2,400 content rules, or in the case of Purview, auto apply policies. Okay. Now, in Purview, there are 2 things going on, retention policies and retention labels. What's the difference? Well, let's give an example. Retention policy, keep 5 years, then destroy. Perfect. What about a retention label? Keep 5 years and destroy. Perfect. Anybody see a problem? They're both doing the same thing, but in totally different ways. A retention policy, the rule is applied to a place, not to a thing, and it's hierarchical. Any document in any place underneath that location will have that rule. So you could apply the rule to an entire site or an entire library, and all the libraries or document sets or every single document in all locations underneath that place will have the same rule. There's no record lockdown. The records are not made immutable. It doesn't use the retention schedule. There's no review process. There's no disposition process. So a retention policy is not records management. So don't use it. A label, however, is the retention rule that's applied to a document, what Microsoft calls an item. And we can do event-based or time-based. Perfect. We can use, we can have a disposition review, which we need. Perfect. It can mark it as a record, which means make it immutable. Also perfect. That's exactly what we need. So we need retention labels. not retention policies, okay? Retention policies are not records keeping. They're not compliant. They're just conveniences. I call them cleanup rules. Labels are what we want. Here's another reason why never to use retention labels, because they compete, or sorry, I got that backwards. Don't use retention policies because they compete with retention labels. Here in Site 1, someone assigned a rule, keep for 5 years. It's hierarchical, so it goes down to everything underneath it. Pretend you're this document right here. Someone comes along and applies a different rule, delete for 10, up here in subsite 1. That means now I have two competing rules, 5 years and 10 years. Later, someone comes along and the records manager, let's say, comes along and auto applies a corporate official rule. The official rule might say, I don't know, keep for 15 years and destroy. Everybody's happy. But now we have three rules, 5, 10, and 15. The 15 is the official one from the retention schedule. A day later, the records manager, or sorry, the user recognizes this and says, wait a minute, what's this 15-year rule doing on my document? I don't like that. I want it for, I don't know, 50 years or 2 years. And they push aside the label that the corporation put on it and put on their own because that's what they want. So now we have 1, 2, 3, 4 competing retention rules on this one document. 4. Which one wins? The one the user put on. Why? Because that's a posture of Purview. Posture is users. That's where compliance comes from. Backwards, that's not where compliance comes from. So when you're using Purview, don't deploy it so that users can do this. So that's it. We've now covered all the topics I intended to cover. I'm going to show you how we do it to do it quickly and avoid mistakes. So we have a tool set called Catalyst, which has 3 components: a complete retention schedule with 2,200 fully described categories with metadata. We have SharePoint IA for those 2,200 libraries, and we have a data loader, which takes that data and creates the SharePoint from it. It's actually a tool of some, I think it's 9. We're up to 9 now. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, nine tools. So this is a cold, hard reality of any EDRMS. This has nothing to do with which of the 5 products you chose to manage your records. You've got to go through these 6 processes. First, you're going to have to change your retention schedule so that it's machine readable by whatever software you bought. Okay. And it's likely going to have to be 2 or 3 times larger. So you do that in a spreadsheet. Then you create a replacement retention schedule that is fully machine readable. We call it software ready. Then you have to load it into your record software, which is no big deal. It should take an afternoon. And you probably are going to load in 50 to 100. But you know what? There's nothing you can do with the software yet. Nothing. First, you have to define a SharePoint information architecture. What libraries? Why? Because you need to make sure that the software can act on those retention rules, and it has to be aware of the content you have. How is it aware of that? The structure, the names of the libraries, and the columns within those libraries. So now you have to build the SharePoint information architecture so that it's aware of all those thousands and thousands and thousands of cases. And each of those libraries, you know what it's about. So that alone can take you a year. Number 5, now you have to actually deploy it in SharePoint. We do step number 4, and sometimes it's took us, I think the longest it's taken us is 4 years almost. It's a spreadsheet. Now you hand that spreadsheet over to IT. And what's in the spreadsheet? Well, 800 libraries times 14 columns is 11,200 column mappings. Yeah, in that spreadsheet. So all of that work has to be built into SharePoint. So now you build it. You call it deploying. This can take you another year. Okay? Fortunately, with Catalyst, we've got that down to a day or so. So we no longer need to do this manually. Now, once this is done and you've got your SharePoint fully deployed, only now can you create those 2400 content rules. Why do you have to wait? Because the content rules specify the names of the libraries and the names of the metadata. The software will check, make sure they exist. You can't even test them unless it exists, right? So this could take you another 6 months easily, up to a year to create these rules. So we don't have this today, but we're now working on another version of Catalyst that will automate step 6 as well. So we already have step 5 fully automated, and hopefully by the end of this year, we'll have step 6 completely automated. Bottom line is that we are taking a multi-year, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars project and shrinking it a lot down to weeks and thousands of dollars instead of years and hundreds of thousands. So in summary, you know what the threats are. One, you don't hit the 85%. Two, failure to manage case records properly. And three, if you're using Purview, failure to deploy it properly. So the fixes are straightforward. Number one, measure improve compliance every day. Number two is deploy an appropriate SharePoint information architecture so that you get the case records done correctly. And if you're using Purview, do these three things. Reverse the compliance posture. Do not use retention policies ever, and use auto apply exclusively. Okay? There's more to avoid, but those are the big three. Do those and you'll be just fine. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. And at any time, feel free to reach out to me and if you have any questions. Thank you.